So, we already know that One Piece will end with Luffy becoming the Pirate King and defeating the world government. But did you ever wonder what would happen to all of the characters after that, like Garp, Shanks, Kobe, or the Straw Hats? Well, today, I'm gonna answer that and more, starting, of course, with the Pirate King himself, Monkey D. Luffy. As you all know, Luffy's ultimate goal has always been simple: to become the freest person in the world! So what could he possibly do once that goal is achieved? Well, even after saving the world, I think that Luffy would still keep sailing the seas. He always wanted to go on more adventures and find new islands, so I don't think that would change even after the story ends. Like his grandpa Garp and his dad Dragon, Luffy would become a well-known person around the world, who people would like and look up to. And of course, he'd spend lots of time with his brother Sabo, enjoying the peace they worked hard to achieve. It's really unlikely Luffy would build a home or live a rich life. Instead, he'd probably stay on a ship for the rest of his life, always going places and exploring. Still, he might sometimes visit places like Alabasta, Dressrosa, or Dawn Island to see his old friends. But now let's answer the question everyone's been asking: who would be Luffy's future wife? Well, for that, I think there's just one good choice, and it's clearly Boa Hancock. I mean, she's been crazy about Luffy since the moment she saw him, and you know how this goes in anime. The girl always ends up with the guy she wants. After a while, they would also have a baby together, which might make Luffy stay in one place for a bit, or maybe not, since I can easily see Luffy just bringing the baby with him on the ship while Boa runs after them. And even though Luffy's life would still be full of adventure after the story ends, Nami's future seems a little more quiet. You see, after achieving her dream of drawing a map of the whole world, it's easy to imagine her going back home in the peaceful Kokoyashi village where her journey started. Back home, Nami would probably spend her time with Nojiko and Genzo, enjoying a quiet life with people who always cared for her, living a life she couldn't have under Arlong's rule. Like her adoptive mom, Belle-Mère, I can easily see Nami becoming a full-time tangerine farmer. But she wouldn't just be some poor worker working all the time. No. She would have her own huge tangerine farm with many people working for her. She'd be able to make this happen using the money she got while sailing with the Straw Hat Pirates. Also, she wouldn't shy away from enjoying nice things, using her money to buy the newest fancy clothes and treat those around her. When it comes to love, Nami doesn't really seem like the type to get into a relationship easily. She likes being free, and I think she'd stay that way, even after the story is over. But one thing we know about Nami is that she loves kids, so it's very possible that she'd adopt a few and raise them like her own. This is the same thing Belle-Mère did, so it fits her story perfectly. With her knowledge and money, Nami could give her children a safe and happy life, something she never had growing up. In her free time, Nami would stay part of the Kokoyashi community and might teach map making or navigation to kids, passing on her skills to the next generation. And although Nami already knew exactly what to do and where to go after finishing her adventure with the Straw Hats, Zoro would get completely lost. Literally. Even after spending years traveling the Grand Line and the New World, Zoro's sense of direction would still be just as bad as always. His first goal would be to return to Shimotsuki village to give back Wado Ichimonji to Kuina's father. But on the way, he would accidentally travel through many countries, forests, mountains, and battlefields. Even when he got clear directions from locals, he would still end up completely lost. It's also important to say that this version of Zoro has already beaten Mihawk and become the world's strongest swordsman, which means he would be very well known around the world. This is why many strong swordsmen from all over the world would keep trying to find him and fight him, and Zoro would happily accept their challenges. After years of wandering, Zoro would finally make it back home to Shimotsuki village by total accident. He wouldn't even know he was there until he saw Kuina's father at the dojo. There, he'd give Wado Ichimonji back to him, hoping that a new kid from the dojo would take it one day and start their own journey. In the next part of his life, Zoro would probably start helping Tashigi with her goal of finding all the legendary swords spread across the world. Their shared love of swords would bring them closer, and after some time, the two would fall in love. For a while, Zoro would settle down with her, teaching their kids how to use swords and passing on the same strength and discipline he once learned from Koshiro. As he got older, Zoro would go from being a swordsman to a teacher. Since his name would still be famous, fighters would keep coming to face him. But now, instead of just beating them, he would start training the ones who had talent, like Mihawk did with him. At this point in his life, his goal wouldn't just be to win, but to teach and inspire the next generation of swordsmen to be even better than he ever was. But while Zoro is busy helping the next generation of swordsmen, Sanji would be doing something totally different. After finally finding the All Blue, the legendary sea with every kind of fish, his life would change a lot. This place would give him all kinds of new ingredients he had never seen before, and he'd finally be able to work on his cooking without always having to fight. After the Straw Hats went their own ways, Sanji would likely stay in the All Blue. There, he would open his own restaurant and start making new recipes and dishes no one had ever tasted before. People from all over the world would come just to eat his food, and he'd have lots of female fans, which means, yes, lots of nosebleeds. Of course, this would make his wife, Pudding, really angry, and she'd keep hitting him just like Nami used to do on the Thousand Sunny. Still, the two of them would have a strong and loving relationship. Sanji wouldn't only cook for rich or famous people either. He would also run a giant charity kitchen where anyone who's hungry, even pirates, could get a meal. Eventually, Sanji and Pudding would have a couple of adorable kids who would love cooking just like their parents. Their kitchen at home would be full of life and fun, and Sanji would teach the kids everything he knows. His Germa 66 family would probably visit too, after they made peace with Sanji for how they treated him when he was younger. There are still 23 characters left to cover, and let's keep going with Usopp, whose adventure would be far from finished at the end of the series. After finally reaching his lifelong dream of becoming a brave warrior of the sea, Usopp would probably travel to Elbaf again, the famous land of giants. There, surrounded by the strongest warriors in the world, Usopp would be treated like a hero. The stories of his battles and his part in saving the world would earn him the respect and admiration of even the toughest giants. But Usopp wouldn't just go there to enjoy the praise. He would also fully explore the culture of Elbaf, train with the giants, and learn what it really means to be a great warrior. Somewhere along the way, he'd finally meet up with his father, Yasopp. Even though Yasopp left him when he was a child, Usopp wouldn't be angry, and the two would quickly reconnect. They would then compete in sniper contests, trying to beat each other with impossible shots, and this time, Usopp might actually have a chance to win. After spending time in Elbaf, Usopp would also visit the Tontada dwarves. These tiny warriors who once saw him as a god would welcome him back with open arms and throw a huge party for him. Well, huge for them. Anyway, on Dressrosa, he'd hang out with Leo and the others, helping with any small tasks or adventures that came up. Later on, Usopp would return home to Syrup Village and tell Kaya all kinds of stories. But this time, the stories would actually be real. After a while, the two would get married and have kids. Kaya would work as a doctor, and Usopp would share his tales with anyone in the village who wanted to listen. Their kids would grow up hearing those stories and would dream of becoming great warriors, just like their father. When his kids are old enough, Usopp would start bringing them along on short adventures around East Blue. He would also go on some trips to the Grand Line alone, but he'd always come back home, not wanting his children to grow up without a father like he did. By the end of his life, Usopp would be known as one of the world's best storytellers, a true warrior and a hero. And while Usopp is busy with all that, Chopper would finally reach his goal, changing the world with his medicine and becoming the world's best doctor. By the end of the series, he would be known for being able to treat all illnesses, even the ones people thought couldn't be cured. News would spread across the oceans about the reindeer doctor who saved thousands of lives, and people would travel from far away just to be healed by him. Of course, Chopper would never charge for his treatments, and he'd help anyone in need. After learning everything there is to know about medicine, Chopper would also go on a journey around the Grand Line to find remote islands and help the people who live there, just like he did during the time skip. His goal would be to give his life-saving medicine to anyone who needed it and help them live better lives. When he got older, Chopper would probably go back to Drum Island and become a regular doctor. He'd follow in Dr. Kureha's footsteps, but do it in his own way, opening a small, real clinic on the island and helping anyone who needed care. Chopper's actions after the war would definitely change the world, but there's another Straw Hat who would be busy making the world better in a slightly different way. You see, with no government rules after the final war, Frankie would finally be free to experiment with all the technology he found along the way. He'd spend the first few years of his new life helping Iceberg make Water 7 float in the air. In case you forgot, this was their plan from the start, since Aqua Laguna kept hitting the city hard. And this way, the city would finally be safe. After that, with the help of a few other scientists, Frankie would create his own science group, similar to Mads, to gather the smartest scientists in the world. Even though we don't know exactly who would join, the group would probably include most of the Vegapunk satellites. Together, they'd share the technology created in the past to make life better for everyone on Earth. They'd build tons of robots and machines that make food so no one would ever be hungry again. In the years that followed, most of the islands around the world would also become safe from storms and natural disasters. As an old man, I can see Frankie continuing Tom's dream by opening his old mentor's workshop again. Even though Frankie would be the boss, he'd probably try to skip boring work and focus on the fun stuff, like putting a cola cannon on some random guy's bike, or whatever wild invention he thinks of that day. And while Frankie would build the future with his own hands, Brook would make it even better with his music. So after ending his journey with the Straw Hats and seeing Laboon again, Brook would decide to show the whale everything the world has to offer, and the two would start their own little adventure. Brook would find a way to get Laboon over the red line, and together they'd travel the world as a musical duo, spreading joy to kids everywhere. The two would visit all kinds of islands, becoming some of the most well-known musicians in the world. Kids all over would learn to play Brook's songs, often not realizing until much later that the skeleton behind the music was once a scary pirate. After many world tours, the legendary pair would finally retire in a big house near the sea. They wouldn't appear in public anymore, but once a year, on the date of the Rum Bar Pirate's last journey, Brook would play a quiet concert by the sea. It would just be him, Laboon, and the memories of the friends they lost. There are still lots of exciting characters to talk about, like Katakuri, Blackbeard, and even Akainu. Can you imagine what their futures might look like? But before that, let's move on to Robin, who would likely spend her time digging up everything the world government tried to hide over the years. It might take her 10 years to find all the missing history, but in the end, she'd put it all together and write a book. Her book would quickly become one of the most famous books in the world and would sell millions of copies. Once called the Devil of Ohara, Robin would now be seen as more of an angel, someone who helps the world understand its past. After completing most of her life's dreams, Robin's next move would be becoming a journalist, maybe even joining Morgan and his team. But she wouldn't be just another boring writer. No, she'd go on dangerous trips all over the world, uncovering some of the biggest secrets and lies. Even though she'd see some of the Straw Hats every now and then during her travels, Robin would likely live life alone. Any romantic moments she had would fade away before anything serious happened, since she'd always be too focused on her missions. Discovering the mysteries of the past is super important, but another Straw Hat would focus on more urgent problems. After the final war, Jinbei would go back to Fishman Island, working to bring fishmen and humans closer together. Even though he helped save the world, it would still be really difficult for him to change how fishmen feel about humans. Following the example of the late Queen Otohime, Jinbei would share stories with the young fishman about his human friends from the Thousand Sunny. It would take a few years, but with patience and help from King Neptune, Jinbei would slowly fix the bond between the two groups. After that, his main goal would be to travel around the world and make sure no one is ever enslaved again. Because of his efforts, Jinbei would be seen as a hero on Fishman Island, and he'd earn a lot of respect from the rest of the world too. Seeing this, King Neptune would likely make him the official ambassador to the Ryugu Kingdom. Since he'd be too busy with all his new duties, it's likely that he wouldn't visit other Straw Hats very often, but that wouldn't stop them from surprising him every now and then. For everything he did for his people, a statue would be made in Jinbei's honor, so future generations would always remember the fishman who helped save their home. Jinbei would cry when he saw it for the first time and promised to keep doing his best. Another character who would make her home proud is Carrot, who would do it by becoming the leader and spokesperson for the minks. Soon after becoming leader of her people, Carrot's first goal would be to make sure the minks spread out into the world, instead of staying hidden on Zou. Knowing Carrot's personality, it's easy to imagine her marrying a husband who stays at home with the kids while she goes on adventures. It would take her a few years to convince the minks to leave Zunesha, since they would probably push back against her ideas at first. But after talking with other countries, the first group of brave minks would go out to explore the world. Carrot would be a fun and different kind of leader who would mostly trust her instincts to make decisions. That might cause problems with other nations sometimes, but hey, it's One Piece, so everything would work out in the end. Another strong leader to rise after the war would be Vivi. She would follow her family's path and help the new era using her royal influence. After the war, she'd spend a few years building friendships between islands and countries to help form a free and honest kind of government. As a peace ambassador, Vivi would travel a lot and give speeches, asking countries all over the world to join the new system. This new government would actually have more countries joining than the old one ever did. Because of this, Vivi's name would live on in history even long after she's gone. Once she feels her work is done and that the world is on the right path, she would suddenly disappear from the public eye. She'd do this to enjoy some well-earned freedom with her friends. At that point, she would try to find some of the old Straw Hats and go on the adventures she always wanted, but couldn't because of her duties. She might help Nami with her tangerine business, explore old ruins with Robin, or even stop by Sanji's restaurant to eat some amazing meals. After spending years having fun with her old crew, Vivi would finally settle down at the quiet lighthouse at the Twin Capes. There, watching the sea where her journey with the Straw Hats began, Vivi would live the rest of her life in peace. Okay, we've covered a lot of good guys so far, but what about talking about a few villains next? For most of the story, Katakuri stayed in the shadow of his family's name and did whatever Big Mom told him to do. But after the final war, he would spend his time trying to convince the people of Whole Cake Island to stop depending on the Big Mom pirates and to start working together with other countries, instead of extorting them like before. This wouldn't be easy, but with Big Mom defeated, Katakuri would finally get his siblings to agree with his plan. After fully breaking apart the Big Mom pirates, Katakuri would be one of the first people to join the new government started by Vivi. He would register Todo Island as an official country and would become its official leader. Even though he wouldn't really want to be in charge, his siblings would push him to do it, knowing he's the best person for the job. A few years later, during one of Luffy's adventures, he and Katakuri would meet again. They would have a friendly spar right away to celebrate, then enjoy a big banquet together. Luffy would be really proud to see how much Katakuri has changed. Once Katakuri gets older, he would retire from leading Todo Land and open a donut shop somewhere on Todo Land. It would quickly become one of the most popular places for visitors, and he'd even start opening more shops all over the world. Since Katakuri has always been a bit of a loner, he probably wouldn't look for romance. Instead, he would live with his siblings and help them find their place in this new world. And even though it's nice to see some of Luffy's old enemies change their ways, Crocodile wouldn't be interested in doing that. After missing his shot at becoming the Pirate King, Crocodile would focus on building a network of criminals for himself. Over the next 10 years, by using his strength and connections, he would become one of the most dangerous people in the world. Things between him and the new government would be tense for a while, since he would keep growing his territory and refusing to follow the new system. But after some time, he'd notice that it's getting harder to find people willing to join his cause, since fewer people want to live a life of crime. That would make him start thinking about how the world is changing and realize that maybe he's been wrong all along. But it wouldn't be until his old friend Ivankov visits him that he'd fully change. Ivankov would convince Crocodile to stop resisting and promise to help him and his crew find real, honest work. Growing old and being tired of always being in battles, Crocodile would finally agree and shut down his criminal empire. Even though many people wouldn't trust that Crocodile had truly changed, he wouldn't really care. He'd move to a quiet place in the desert to live the rest of his life. He would still keep some of his old connections though, and act as a kind of freelancer for the new government, sending his soldiers to dangerous islands to help keep the peace. Of course, he'd only do it for a big payday. Some things never change. And that same saying fits Sabo too, who would spend the next few years making sure the freed islands could take care of themselves without falling into chaos. Pretty much the same thing he always did. His first goal would be to turn the Goa Kingdom, his hometown, into a real country where everyone is treated equally. He would also try to remove kings and rulers from the world and instead ask people to vote on what they want, helping create a new type of democracy that keeps the peace. But he wouldn't stop there. Sabo would be one of Vivi's strongest allies and would help her complete a mission too by traveling to various countries and convincing them to join the new system. Even if the Revolutionary Army is no longer active by this point, Sabo and his old colleagues would still be ready to step in if trouble showed up anywhere in the world. On these rare missions, he would work in secret, striking fast and disappearing before anyone could react. People would talk about him like a ghost, one that shows up in times of danger to protect them and keep them safe. Later in life, Sabo would eventually settle down in the Goa Kingdom, working as a history teacher. He'd open a small school with the goal of teaching the next generation not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Although we don't know much about Sabo's love life in the story, I believe he would eventually marry Koala, and the two would have a bunch of children together. By the end of his life, Sabo would be remembered not just as a revolutionary, but as someone who helped make the world a better place. Now, all the characters we've talked about so far are likely to survive until the end of the story. But what about someone whose future isn't so certain? A lot of fans believe that Shanks won't make it through the final war and might sacrifice himself for Luffy or someone else he cares about. But if he does survive, I have a few ideas for what his life could look like. To begin with, since Shanks is already over 40, I think he would settle down right away and end his days as a pirate. He'd then break up the Red Hair Pirates, and everyone would go their own way, meeting up now and then to share stories and drink together. As for Shanks, he'd enjoy a calm life in the Goa Kingdom with his wife, Makino. That might sound strange to some of you, but there are theories about the two being a couple, so I'm going with that. They would also have a son, and Shanks would make sure to raise the boy to be the true heir of the Garling family, not like his father or brother. In his free time, I can also see Shanks helping the next generation of pirates, giving them tips on what routes to take and what islands to check out. He'd also get the occasional visit from Luffy, Buggy, and Mihawk. With Luffy, he'd talk about adventures. With Mihawk, he'd constantly argue and try to fight. And with Buggy, well, there'd be lots of yelling. Eventually, many years later, Shanks would pass away in his wife's arms. And at that point, the pirates from both the old and new eras, along with the Marines, would come to honor him. It would be the biggest funeral ever held. And despite the presence of many different groups, there would be no fighting, only silence and respect for the man who helped save the world. And while Shanks would be kindly remembered by everyone, his childhood friend Buggy would take a slightly different path. Buggy the Clown was once feared around the world, but after the Straw Hats became the crew that found the One Piece, Cross Guild would slowly fade into irrelevance. Forgotten and beaten once again, Buggy would have no choice but to go back to his old ways, causing chaos in small towns. But when he isn't bothering citizens, Buggy would keep searching for Captain John's famous treasure, and after a few years, he'd finally find it. In case you forgot, this was the same treasure Buggy was looking for even before the time skip. But finding the treasure wouldn't work out great for Buggy, because he'd have to spend almost all of it to pay off his debts to Crocodile and Mihawk. Even so, he'd still be left with a good amount of money, and with it, he'd start the world's biggest charity to help people. Wait, what? Let me explain. You see, all Buggy ever really wanted was to be loved and admired, and he'd quickly realize that running charities would be a great way to make people adore him without risking his life in battle. Sure, he'd be doing charity for the wrong reasons, but at least some people would get real help. As time went on and Buggy became more and more famous, he'd host bigger and bigger events, and he'd even stop by Shanks' house a couple of times to brag about how popular he was getting. With all that fame going to his head, Buggy would even write a book called Buggy, the True King of the Pirates, which would consist of a bunch of over-the-top stories that mostly didn't even happen. The next character I want to talk about is Kuma, who, despite everything he's been through, would get a happy ending. With Vegapunk's help, I believe Kuma would get his mind back and slowly return to being himself. After years of following the promised sun god, Kuma would go back to being a regular priest. He'd return to the Sorbet Kingdom with Bonnie, and the two of them would live the rest of their lives in peace. They'd do their best to heal others and help as many people as possible, and would be among the first to support the kingdom's switch to Vivi's new system. Instead of being seen as a tyrant, people would start calling Kuma a saint, and he would get visitors from all over the world. Some of those visitors would even include old Straw Hats, now dealing with back pain from aging. While Kuma is busy helping others, Bonnie would eventually find her way to Sanji's all-blue restaurant, saying she wants to be his student. But in reality, her plan is just to get as much food as possible for free. Still, I don't think she'd want to be away from her father for too long, so she would always go back to him in the end. Later on in the Sorbet Kingdom, the people would build a statue of Kuma to thank him for everything he did for them. There are only 10 characters left, so let's move on to Yamato, who would finally be free to do what she truly wants. Instead of becoming like her father, she'd live like Odin and carry on his legacy. Once peace returns after the fall of the world government, Yamato would use Odin's journal to mark the islands Odin visited and try to follow the same path. This journey would take many years, with Yamato joining different crews to reach each place. At some point, she would meet up with Robin again and help her find a hidden poneglyph on one of the Sky Islands. Eventually, like Odin, Yamato would reach Laugh Tale and finish his dream. After that, she would return to Wano and help Momonosuke lead for a while. At first, the people of Wano wouldn't know how to accept her, but over time, they'd start seeing her as a true hero. By the time the cherry blossoms bloom again on Wano's mountains, Yamato would be standing under the tree, smiling. He'd finally feel complete, because now he's living his own life, not just following someone else's dream. And since Yamato is included here, we also have to talk about what the future looks like for Momo. After the final war ends, Momonosuke would go back to his people in Wano, where a huge festival would be planned to honor him. But instead of celebrating, he'd shock everyone by announcing that Wano would not only open its borders, but also join Vivi's new government. Some people in Wano wouldn't agree with this right away, but they'd understand it was needed after so many years of isolation. The first big thing Momo would do is build a history archive under the rebuilt Flower Capital. This place would hold important documents about Wano's past and its future goals. Over the next few years, Momo would focus on sharing Wano's culture with the rest of the world and trying to move past the old traditions that once held them back. These actions would earn him respect from rebels, historians, and other leaders, making him an important figure in shaping the new era. Now, even though it might sound surprising, losing his title as the world's strongest swordsman to Zoro would actually be freeing for Mihawk. He did enjoy being the best, but he'd feel proud that someone finally beat him, and happy to travel the Grand Line without being challenged all the time. Over the years, he would get used to living like a normal person, often visiting his old rival Shanks to talk about their past fights. Wanting to disappear from fame, Mihawk would probably use a fake name and change how he looked so no one would recognize him. He'd settle on a small island and take in a few students to teach sword fighting. Even though people see him as cold, Mihawk would care deeply about the students he trains. Most would never know who he really is. They'd just see him as the quiet old master with sharp, hawk-like eyes. His secret dojo would become a legend among swordsmen, talked about in bars and hidden corners of the world. Many would try to find it, but Mihawk would only train the ones he believed were truly worthy. And when he got old, Mihawk would give his sword, Yoru, to one final student, hoping that this person might one day defeat Zoro and take the title of the new strongest swordsman. And while Mihawk decided to live a quiet life after the story ends, another one of Luffy's old enemies, Smoker, would have a much tougher time. Because of his role in the final war, Smoker would be promoted to the new Marine Commander-in-Chief. He'd be given a nearly impossible task: to fix the broken Marine system. This would take many years, but Smoker would rebuild the Marines from scratch by personally picking the first few people he believes can protect the peace that the Straw Hats worked so hard for. With Smoker in charge, the people would slowly begin to trust the Marines again, and they wouldn't be seen as just tools of the government anymore. Once the Marines are fully reformed, Smoker would finally have some time to relax and would marry his longtime girlfriend, Hina. Their wedding would be a huge global event, talked about in every newspaper. Of course, Smoker wouldn't care about the media attention, he'd actually find it super annoying. After that, the two would work together to make sure the new generation of Marines doesn't repeat the same mistakes as the old one. That's why they would slowly start promoting people like Tashigi, Kobe, and Helmeppo to important positions to make sure peace continues for a long time. Once he gets old, Smoker would probably retire to a small coastal town, spending his mornings fishing and his afternoons smoking cigars while thinking about the days he used to chase after Luffy. Moving on to Law, after the final war, he would finally learn everything there is to know about the D-Clan, which would complete his journey. He wouldn't feel too bad about not becoming Pirate King, since he always knew that title was meant for Luffy. So I believe that after helping free the world, Law would go back to studying medicine and would team up with Chopper. The two of them would work together on surgeries and create cures for some of the world's worst illnesses. Famous across the globe for his work, Law's name would end up in the history books, and many hospitals and schools would be named after him. He'd be invited to speak at the top medical schools on the Grand Line, where young doctors would get to learn directly from him. Eventually, when he retires, Law would have plenty of money saved up and would use it to build modern clinics in poor, faraway places, so that even the smallest villages have access to great healthcare. He would do this to make sure that no child ever suffers the way he once did. I also believe he'd open a few orphanages around the Grand Line, and he'd name them after his old friend Corazon. Now, most fans agree that Blackbeard will probably die by the end of the story, or at the very least, end up in prison. But just in case that doesn't happen, here's what I think his future could look like. Spoiler alert, it's not a happy one. Defeated and embarrassed after his plan to take over the world fails, Blackbeard would spend the next few years refusing to accept the new system. Hunted down by Smoker's Marines, he'd spend night after night coming up with new plans to take revenge, but nothing would work. Jumping from island to island, Blackbeard would start to lose his mind. Drinking too much, eating piles of cherry pie, and yelling at people around him, he'd go completely insane. Instead of fearing him like before, people would just laugh at him, and most wouldn't even know who he was anymore. As an old man, he'd end up doing odd jobs for money and gambling away everything he earned. In the end, he'd be completely alone, sitting in the streets, telling wild stories that no one believes, wishing he could go back to the days when the Grand Line feared his name. A man's dreams never dies. Well, looks like that wasn't quite true in Blackbeard's case. But that's enough tragedy for now, so let's talk about the new hero of the Marines, Kobe, who would continue to live up to his mentor's legacy. Praised for his actions against Emu and for being an important part of Sword, Kobe would earn worldwide recognition. Kids from across the seas would be inspired by his bravery and kind heart, dreaming of becoming like him one day. But none of that would really matter to �KOBE, and he'd be totally unaware of how famous he's become. Instead of relaxing in peace, �KOBE would spend the next few years working with Smoker to improve the Marines. He'd help choose new recruits and teach former Marines what real justice should be. Thanks to his strong reputation, he'd bring in thousands of new Marines, which would make Smoker's job much easier. Alongside his wife, Hibari, �KOBE would travel the world, checking Marine bases to make sure everything is running smoothly. Even though he's a hero, �KOBE would stay humble, often choosing to sleep in regular barracks with other soldiers instead of the fancy rooms made for officers. �KOBE would also give speeches that inspire other Marines to keep doing the right thing, but to him, they'd just be honest words from the heart. His personal motto would be justice with compassion. When he wasn't working, �KOBE would sit by the sea with Hibari, watching young cadets train and wondering what Luffy is doing these days. But not all Marines would adjust so easily to this new peaceful world, especially the 3 former admirals. So let's take a look at what they'd do after the story ends. First is Kizaru. After everything that happened, he'd realize that he had spent many years fighting for the wrong cause. He would feel deep regret and no longer see himself as worthy of representing justice. Because of this, he would leave his job and disappear. 𝗲𝗏𝗏 would then try to make peace with 𝗤𝗏𝗏maru, but his old nephew would reject him. This would push 𝗲𝗏𝗏 into a new phase of life, traveling without purpose, hoping to make up for his past. As time passed, he would begin to change. He'd become kinder, more thoughtful, and would help people, not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to. The man once feared as Kizaru would become a kind mystery man, known in small towns and remote islands. Some people would figure out who he was, they wouldn't fear him anymore. I can easily see him working as a handyman, helping fix homes, working on farms, or even serving drinks at a small bar. Eventually, 𝗤𝗏𝗏maru would hear rumors about an old man with light powers who helps poor villages. Curious, he'd look into it and find that it's actually 𝗲𝗏𝗏. Once they finally meet again, the two wouldn't even need to say anything. They'd just embrace each other. In his final years, 𝗲𝗏𝗏 would settle down in the Sorbet Kingdom close to Kuma's church. There, he would enjoy a peaceful life with Kuma, 𝗤𝗏𝗏maru, and Bonnie at his side. Now, even though Aokiji was part of Blackbeard's crew, his life would turn out nothing like Teach's. After seeing Blackbeard's group fail to take over the world, Aokiji wouldn't be surprised. He never really cared about them anyway. Since he was always a chill guy, literally, I think that after the war ends, Aokiji would start a strange but fun hobby, organizing bike races across the sea. He'd create long ice paths across the ocean using his devil fruit and race with others. This hobby would quickly grow into a real business, and the races would become hugely popular around the world. He would even start getting sponsors from big companies and even 𝗏𝗏𝗏mushi broadcasts for his events. Over time, Aokiji would turn his races into charity events, raising money for orphanages, rebuilding towns, and cleaning up the oceans. His races would become a huge global hit, but even with all the fame, he'd still show up wearing flip-flops and carrying his usual sleep mask. In the end, Aokiji wouldn't be remembered as a pirate or a marine. He'd be remembered as that strange but awesome guy who created a new sport and used it to help people. And that's exactly how he'd want it. And even though the first 2 admirals managed to turn their lives around, Akainu's future would be a bit darker. If Akainu makes it through the final war alive, he would probably spend a big part of his life in prison for all the terrible things he did in the name of absolute justice. Still, since Akainu also did some good while he was admiral, he wouldn't stay in jail forever, and he'd eventually be released. But even then, he'd stay just as stubborn and strict about his beliefs. That is, until he sees the change brought by Smoker, �KOBE, and the new Marines. After witnessing a world that's much happier and more peaceful than it was under the world government, Akainu would begin to understand that he had been wrong. He would refuse to leave his house, spending his days thinking about what he did and the damage it caused. Then, one day, he'd get an unexpected visitor, �KOBE. After a short conversation, �KOBE would convince Akainu to return to the Marines, not as a leader, but as an instructor. Even though he couldn't undo the harm he caused, he could at least teach the next generation not to repeat those mistakes. Still unsure, Akainu would eventually agree. On his first day as an instructor, most of the young cadets would be terrified of him. Akainu would be tough, but fair. And slowly, the students would see that he's not as heartless as they thought. Akainu would know that this isn't enough to make up for his past, but he'd finally find some meaning in helping the new Marines and guiding them in the right direction. And if you liked this video, click on this one next where I explain what would have happened if Ace had defeated Blackbeard during their duel. Go ahead, click it.